Welcome back. It's part two of the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression. We learned about the Roaring Twenties and how after World War I, America was on top of the world. So, what could go wrong? Well, let's look at the factors that all combined to lead to the Great Depression. First, let's talk about the stock market. So, when you buy stock, that means you're buying part of a company, and you buy stock in something called a share. The value of stock is linked to how well the company is doing. Businesses need to sell stock so they can expand their services or products. In the 1920s, people thought it was an easy way to get rich quick or make a lot of money fast. You put your money into the business does well, you make more money. Seems easy, right? Well, prices went up so high in the stock market in the late 1920s because people could buy stock on credit. It's also called buying on margin. So, for example, if you wanted to buy $100 worth of stock, you would give the stockbroker $10 and borrow $90. And then when your stock made money, that money would go to pay off the $90 loan. But what if your stock doesn't make any money? Huh, that would be weird. People were also tricked into buying misleading stocks for either companies that didn't exist or for products that were never made. But people had no way to check to see how companies were doing or if any of that stuff was really true. Now we can use our phone, the TV, the newspaper. None of that was around. Well, newspapers were around, but they didn't report stocks in the 1920s. People didn't realize they could lose all their money. Well, what about the banks? Let's talk about the banks. Banks were bad in the 1920s. They weren't following the rules. Well, there weren't really any rules back then. They were lending out too much money. They ran out of money to loan people, so they started borrowing money from companies. But the companies couldn't pay the banks fast enough, and the companies started to run out of money. The bank started using money from people's deposits into their accounts to cover loans. That's the money that you put into your bank account, which means that there wasn't enough money for people to take out of the bank if they wanted to. There was also a problem with the bank owning too much foreclosed property. That means property that they've taken back from people who couldn't pay the loan on it. And you can't make money on that property unless you sell it. Part of the problem was they had given too much credit to people. Remember we talked about the beginning of credit cards and installment payments? They did that too often and gave people more than they could afford to pay back. So people weren't making their payments, which means the bank wasn't making their money back. Let's head out west to the Midwest and talk about farms and what went wrong out there. The farming industry was overproducing still after the war. Remember, during World War I, they were sending produce to Europe. Well, now that's over, and they didn't need to. They only needed to feed America. So they had too much produce, which meant the prices went down because the demand went down. They also had to compete with foreign imported goods, so produce from other countries coming into America. Some farmers had to foreclose on their farms or give their farms back to the bank because they couldn't pay. Then there were poor farming practices and a drought in the mid 1920s that just kind of all led to a decline in the farming industry. Well, what's the government doing about this? Well, in the 1920s, the government wasn't watching over the stock market and banks. They thought that the market would correct itself if it started to change. Two-thirds of businesses were controlled by holding companies. Holding companies are larger businesses that own a lot of smaller businesses. And then those larger businesses provide direction and management to the smaller businesses. We also saw an unequal distribution of wealth because of some of these monopolies in the business world. That means the rich was really rich and the poor, well, they were really poor. And there wasn't much of an in between. So, all these factors mixed together inside of a giant powder keg. And in October of 1929, boom, the powder keg exploded and the Great Depression started. Stay tuned for part three and find out what happened when the Great Depression started. Bye for now.